Good Parents: How the World Raised Its Children. We explore something that every generation in history believed they had figured out: the right way to raise a child. They were all certain, and they were all, in ways large and small, completely wrong. If you had walked through a city in the early part of the last century and looked up, you might have seen something strange. Attached to the outside of windows, 3 or 4 floors up, were wire cages, and inside those cages were babies, suspended above the street, often with no one watching. The parents who put them there were not cruel. Fresh air is good for babies, but a wire box hung from an old window frame 3 floors up, with no safety standards, was a different thing from a walk in the park. Organizations distributed them anyway. It was modern. It was progressive. It was good parenting. This is only one small moment in a very long story. For as long as there have been children, there have been people explaining the correct way to raise them. Some of that advice was wise. Much of it was strange. And some of it, looked at from the distance of time, is almost impossible to believe. This is the story of the Good Parents. Wrapped in cloth and left to wait. In the world before modern medicine, a newborn baby was a fragile and uncertain thing. Many did not survive their first weeks. Many more did not survive their first year. The people who cared for them were not indifferent to this. They worried deeply, and they did what they believed would help. The problem was that almost nothing they believed was correct. One of the oldest and most widespread practices in the raising of infants was swaddling. Across Europe and much of the rest of the world, for many hundreds of years, newborn babies were wrapped tightly in long strips of cloth from their shoulders to their feet. The arms were pinned against the body. The legs were bound straight. The idea behind it was straightforward. People believed that the limbs of a newborn were soft and unformed, and that without firm wrapping, they would grow crooked. The cloth was the mold. The baby was the clay. A swaddled baby could not move. It could not reach out, roll over, or bring its hands to its face. It spent most of its day lying flat, stiff as a small plank, waiting for the cloth to be removed and replaced, which happened infrequently since unwrapping and rewrapping was slow and difficult, and took up to 2 hours when done carefully. In the time between changes, the baby lay in whatever had accumulated inside the wrapping. This was simply accepted as a feature of infant life. The swaddled baby was also easier to manage. It could be propped against a wall, hung from a hook, or placed on a shelf while the adults around it went about their work. In a world where most families worked long physical days, in fields, in workshops, in kitchens that required constant attention, a baby that could not move was a baby that could be left safely in one place for hours at a time. This was not cruelty. It was a practical arrangement inside a life that left very little room for anything else. Swaddling also served another purpose that its practitioners believed in sincerely. It was thought to keep the baby warm. The tight wrapping held body heat close. In cold stone houses, in winters without central heating, this was not nothing. And there was some truth in the warmth argument. Swaddled babies do retain heat better. The reasoning was wrong, but the result had one small benefit buried inside it. The practice began to be questioned slowly, by different thinkers in different places, over the course of several centuries. Some physicians argued that the limbs did not need to be straightened, that they would straighten on their own. Others pointed out that babies in the warmer climates, where swaddling was less common, did not grow up with crooked limbs. Little by little, the wrapping loosened, but it did not disappear quickly. Swaddling in one form or another remained common in many parts of Europe well into the period when other practices, equally strange, equally confident, had already taken its place. In the next chapter, we move into a world where childhood had started to be seen differently, but where the advice being offered was no less strange for being newer. Small adults and the age of obedience. For most of human history, childhood was not understood the way we understand it today. The idea that children live in a separate world, one that should be protected, nurtured, kept innocent for as long as possible, is relatively new. For most of the centuries before our own, children were seen as small adults, and they were expected to begin behaving like adults as soon as they were physically capable. In the households of working families across Europe, a child of 6 or 7 was already a contributor to the family's survival. Children in farming families worked in the fields. Children in craft households swept, fetched, sorted, and minded younger siblings. Children whose families had trades learned those trades early, sometimes beginning as apprentices while still very young. Play existed, but it was not something that adults organized or supervised. It happened in whatever gaps remained in a day that was otherwise fully occupied. The clothing of children reflected this view. Wealthy families dressed their children in scaled-down versions of adult clothing. The same heavy fabrics, the same formal shapes, the same structured layers. A portrait of a wealthy family from a few hundred years ago often requires a careful second look before the children can be identified, because nothing in the way they are dressed marks them as different from their parents. They are simply shorter. What was most important to parents and teachers of this period, above almost everything else, was obedience. Parenting guides from the 17th and 18th centuries return to this theme on almost every page. The child's will was seen as something dangerous, a force that, if left unchecked, would produce an adult who was selfish, ungovernable, and lost. The parent's job was to break that will early, firmly, and completely, while the child was still young enough to be shaped. One widely read guide from the period stated plainly that a parent who allowed a child to have its own way in infancy was making a serious and permanent mistake. The younger the child, the more important it was to establish control. Some writers argued that the process should begin before the child could speak. Obedience, they said, was not something to be taught. It was something to be demanded from the very beginning. Physical punishment was part of this system, but it was not the whole of it. Children were also kept hungry at times, denied comforts, and made to sit or stand for long periods without moving. These were not considered punishments in the same sense as hitting. They were simply the conditions of a correctly ordered childhood. A child that was comfortable, warm, and full at all times would become, the experts warned, impossible to manage. Wet nurses were also common in wealthier households during this period. A woman who had recently given birth and was producing milk would be employed to nurse another family's infant, freeing the mother from feeding duties. The infant might spend its earliest months in the wet nurse's home, away from its own family entirely. This was considered unremarkable, efficient even. The emotional connection between mother and infant was not something that the era spent much time thinking about. In the next chapter, we arrive in a period when science began to enter the nursery, and when the advice it brought with it was stranger than almost anything that had come before. The syrup and the cage. By the middle of the 19th century, Something had shifted. Cities had grown large and dense. Families were smaller and more separated from extended relatives than they had been in earlier generations. And for the first time, a market had appeared for products and advice specifically aimed at parents, things you could buy and things you could read that promised to make the raising of children easier and safer. Some of what was sold during this period is difficult to look at now. Pharmacies stocked bottles of liquid intended for fussy babies and teething infants. These products had various names, but most of them contained the same active ingredient: opium. Laudanum, a mixture of opium dissolved in alcohol, had been used as a medicine for adults for a long time, and during the 19th century it became common for parents to give small amounts to crying babies. It stopped the crying. It helped the baby sleep. It was sold over the counter, advertised in newspapers, and recommended by some physicians. One of the most popular products of this kind was called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. It was marketed directly to mothers and described on its label as an invaluable remedy for children during the difficult period of teething. The instructions suggested giving it to any infant that was restless, in pain, or simply crying too much. It was trusted. It was widely used. It contained morphine. The effects of giving opium preparations to infants were not hidden so much as they were misunderstood. Babies became quiet and still, which was interpreted as comfort and rest. Some became addicted. Some died. The connection between the syrup and these outcomes was not always made, partly because infant death was common enough that any single cause was hard to isolate, and partly because no one was looking for it. The product had a good reputation. The label said it was safe. Alongside the syrups, a different kind of product was taking shape, one driven not by chemistry, but by a growing belief in the power of fresh air. Doctors of the period were increasingly convinced that the air inside city apartments was unhealthy. Coal fires, poor ventilation, and the closeness of many bodies in small rooms all contributed to an atmosphere that physicians blamed for a wide range of childhood illnesses. The solution, they argued, was outdoor air, and plenty of it. For families with gardens or access to parks, this was easy enough to manage. But for the growing number of families living in apartment buildings in London, New York, Berlin, and other expanding cities, getting a baby outside required effort that was not always available. A woman managing a household alone, with no help and no lift in her building, could not easily carry an infant down several flights of stairs every day. The window cage was invented to solve this problem. A wire enclosure, roughly the size of a large drawer, attached to the outside of a window frame with brackets. The baby was placed inside on a small mattress. The window was opened and the cage swung out over the street below. The baby lay in the open air, at whatever height the apartment happened to be, while the mother continued her work inside. It was patented, sold through catalogues, and distributed by child welfare organizations. Newspapers photographed babies resting peacefully in their cages above city streets. Some buildings had several cages visible from the pavement at once, hanging at different floors like small occupied boxes attached to the brickwork. Passers-by looked up. Most did not stop. In the next chapter, we meet the man who decided that everything that had come before, the syrups, the cages, the softness of mothers, was wrong, and who offered a completely different system in its place. The man who said, "Never hug your child." In the years after the First World War, a new kind of authority entered the world of child rearing. Psychology, the scientific study of the mind and behavior, was still young as a formal discipline, but it was growing quickly, and some of its practitioners were eager to apply what they had learned in laboratories to the nursery and the family home. One of the most influential of these was an American psychologist named John Watson. Watson believed that human behavior was not shaped by instinct or emotion, but by conditioning, by the patterns of stimulus and response that were built up through experience. He had demonstrated this in experiments with animals, and he believed the same principles applied to children. If the right conditions were created around a child from birth, Watson argued, that child could be shaped into almost any kind of adult. The environment was everything. The parent was the engineer. From this belief, Watson developed a set of parenting recommendations that he published in a book and promoted widely through popular magazines. The book sold in very large numbers. His advice reached a generation of parents across North America and beyond, and many of them followed it. The core of Watson's advice was emotional distance. He believed that mothers, in particular, were too affectionate with their children. Too much warmth, he argued, produced adults who were weak, dependent, and unable to function independently in the world. The solution was to treat children not as objects of love, but as small people in training, to be firm, consistent, and above all, restrained. His specific instructions were clear. Parents should not hug their children. They should not kiss them. They should not allow a child to sit on their lap. If absolutely necessary, a parent might kiss the child once on the forehead at bedtime. In the morning, a handshake was appropriate. Praise should be given sparingly and only for genuine achievement. Comfort, when a child was upset, should be limited. The child needed to learn that the world did not stop moving when they cried. Watson raised his own children according to these principles. He described his sons in print as examples of the system working correctly: independent, unemotional, capable. What he did not write about was what his family experienced privately. His children, as adults, were troubled. One of his sons later attempted suicide. Watson's granddaughter, the actress Mariette Hartley, wrote in her memoir about the cold and distant atmosphere of a household shaped by her grandfather's theories, and the ways in which that atmosphere affected the people inside it for decades. Watson himself, near the end of his life, acknowledged that the parenting advice in his book had been premature. He had not done enough research. He had moved too quickly from his laboratory conclusions to prescriptions for how real children in real families should be raised. But by then, the book had already passed through a great many hands. The advice had already reached a great many nurseries, and the children raised inside that system were already grown. In the next chapter, we look at how the mid-20th century brought a completely different approach, warmer, slower, more attentive, and how that shift changed what parents expected of themselves and their children. Dr. Spock and the permission to be warm. In the years after the Second World War, millions of families across the United States and Western Europe were starting over. Soldiers had come home. Marriages had been formed quickly, sometimes before the war, and sometimes immediately after. Babies arrived in large numbers, and into this moment of new families and new beginnings came a book that would become one of the best-selling books in history. A book about how to raise children, written by a pediatrician named Benjamin Spock. Spock's book, published in the mid-1940s, began with a sentence that had not appeared in any parenting guide before it. Trust yourself. You know more than you think you do. After decades of advice that had told parents, and mothers especially, that their instincts were dangerous, that their affection was a problem, that experts knew better than they did. Spock's opening was almost startling in its warmth. He was telling parents to relax. He was telling them that they were probably doing better than they feared. The advice that followed was practical and calm. Feed the baby when it is hungry, not on a rigid schedule. Pick it up when it cries. Let it sleep when it is tired. These things may sound obvious today, but they ran directly against the recommendations that had dominated the previous generation. Watson's system had insisted on strict routines, limited touch, and emotional distance. Spock said nearly the opposite. Babies need to be held. They need to feel that the world is warm and reliable. This is not weakness. This is how healthy people grow. The book became a companion in millions of households. Mothers kept it in the kitchen and beside the bed. They consulted it for fevers, for sleeping problems, for the particular anxieties of every stage of early childhood. Spock's voice was conversational and reassuring. He wrote as if he was sitting across the table from a tired parent, not lecturing from a podium. That tone was new, and people responded to it. The generation of children raised according to Spock's approach grew up with more physical warmth and more emotional permission than the generation before them. They were held when they cried. They were spoken to gently. Their feelings were acknowledged rather than dismissed. The differences were real, and they accumulated across millions of families into something that looked, from a distance, like a shift in what childhood felt like. But Spock was not without critics. Some argued that his approach produced children who were too comfortable, too easily disappointed by a world that would not always be warm. Others pointed out that his advice, though kind in tone, was still built on assumptions that not everyone shared. That his ideal family had a mother at home during the day, a father who provided, and a household with enough space and enough stability that gentle routines could be maintained without effort. For families that did not look like this, the book's warmth could feel beside the point. And behind Spock, other questions were already forming. What happened to the children who had been raised under Watson's rules? What did the harshness of earlier systems leave behind? Research into child development was advancing, and what it was finding would slowly change the questions that parents were being asked to consider. In the next chapter, we arrive in our own time and look back at the full length of this strange and earnest history. What every generation got wrong. Every generation of parents has believed, with complete sincerity, that they were raising their children correctly. The parents who wrapped their babies tightly in cloth were certain they were preventing deformity. The parents who gave their infants soothing syrup were certain they were relieving pain. The parents who hung wire cages from their windows were certain they were providing something essential. The parents who withheld hugs were certain they were building strength. They were not cruel people. They were people who were doing what the knowledge of their time told them to do. Following the advice of doctors, reading the recommended books, buying the products that were advertised as safe and modern and good. The certainty with which they acted was not a sign of arrogance. It was simply the normal confidence of people who believed they had access to the best available understanding of how children worked. What they did not know, what no generation fully knows, is what the next generation will think when it looks back. Research into early childhood has changed dramatically over the past several decades. Studies have shown that the first years of a child's life are more important, in more specific ways, than earlier generations understood. The connection between an infant and the people who care for it shapes the developing brain in ways that last. Touch matters. Consistency matters. The feeling of being responded to, of crying and having someone come, builds something in the nervous system that a child carries for a long time. These things are not sentimentality. They are biology. This research has also made it possible to look back at some of the practices of the past and understand their effects more precisely. Children raised in environments of extreme emotional distance, in institutions or in households where Watson's principles were applied with unusual strictness, show patterns of difficulty in later life that researchers can now trace back to those early years. The absence of warmth is not neutral. It leaves something behind. But this knowledge does not make the present generation immune to the same kind of errors. Every era has its certainties, its confident experts, its popular books, its products sold to anxious parents as the correct solution. The details change. The structure does not. What is different now is the sheer volume of advice available. A parent today can find, within a few seconds, 10 different recommendations on any question of child rearing, several of which will directly contradict the others. Where earlier generations had too little information, the present one sometimes has too much. The anxiety is different in shape, but not necessarily smaller. And somewhere inside all of it, inside all the advice and the products and the theories and the mistakes, something simpler has probably always been true. Children need to be fed and kept warm. They need to feel that the person caring for them is present and reliable. They need, gradually, to be given more room to move and to fail and to figure things out. These needs have not changed much across the centuries. The difficulty has always been in how much noise surrounds them. The babies in the wire cages are gone. The soothing syrup is gone. The handshake at breakfast is gone. What remains is the same hope that has existed in every generation, that the child in front of you will grow up well, and that what you are doing right now is helping rather than harming. Most of the time it is, and that is where this story rests.